Hallo, herzlich willkommen zurück zu Immersive X. Jetzt seht ihr auch mal den Moderator in seinem tatsächlichen Aussehen und nicht nur als kleinen Avatar. Wir werden jetzt auch direkt zu Englisch switchen, because our keynote speaker is live here from New York. Mark Zuckerberg recently said that our overarching goal is to help bring the metaverse to life. What is this metaverse? It's a collective shared space that has the potential to bridge the virtual and physical in new and unexpected ways. It has a fully fledged economy, and we users have the chance to take our avatars, our virtual goods from one place within this metaverse to another place, no matter who runs this specific part of it. If this still seems complicated to you, we are very happy that we have an expert on this today here at our conference. He's an alumnus of the Sundance Screenwriting Lab and recognized as a pioneer in mixing storytelling and technology. He's a founding member of the Digital Storytelling Lab, established 2013 at Columbia University, and that is designed to explore the future and the current state of landscape of storytelling. And Wired magazine named him one of the 25 people helping to reinvent entertainment and change the face of Hollywood. He will give us an interesting outlook on and talk about decentralized storytelling, where AI, the blockchain, and metaverse intersect. I'm very happy that we have someone here who really, whenever a new technology is on the horizon, he's one of the first to explore it. Please welcome, live from New York, Lance Weiler.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Can you hear me okay? Let me just make sure that you can actually hear me. Make sure I'm not muted. Oh, I'm not. You can hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be a guest of Immersive X. And as mentioned, I'm kind of always exploring. So I guess in some ways, I'm almost like an anthropologist. And what I hope to do here is kind of, tell you what I've found along the way, and this talk will kind of do a couple different things. It will share work, and it will also share process. And along the way, I'll share some of the things that I've learned that hopefully maybe could help others who are looking to try to apply their craft to this ever-shifting digital landscape. So today I'll be talking about decentralized storytelling, touching into the AI, AI and the blockchain and code, and kind of unpacking a little bit, at least how I'm looking at the metaverse. And so, all good stories usually start with some type of an origin story. And I want to give you a sense of where this kind of comes from and how I've, where the thought process kind of started, I guess. For those of you who don't know what you're looking at right now, this is actually a relic. It is a Bolex spring-wound 16mm camera. And when I was in high school, I had a paper route, and I bought the camera, and I started making experimental films, and I fell in love with, cinema. And I loved the freedom that I had with being able to make it, but there were always so many barriers to actually being able to create something, saving up the money for the film, having to gather everybody to shoot, sending it off to a lab, and then, the various processes that are associated with cinema. And along the way, what I want to kind of focus on here is a moment where things really kind of radically changed for me. And I want to kind of share that epiphany because it helps to set what will come next in the talk. So, I've spent over 20 years working in production, in development, in distribution, and I've spent a lot of that time developing films and releasing them in TV and theater and games and installations, and I've also been doing quite a bit of work that's very difficult to classify. And often what ends up happening is I find myself describing all the things that something is not in order to help somebody understand what the potential of it could be. And so I find myself straddled between these two worlds, a world of preservation and a world of innovation. So the epiphany moment comes with this movie that I made a long time ago now, over 20 years ago. But I want to share this because it was a moment for me where I started to think about storytelling in a very different way. And the film that you see here is called The Last Broadcast. We started it in 1996. And the moment that I had this epiphany was I worked all night on a music video, and I found I was at Penn Station in New York, and I was in a newsstand. I was flipping through a magazine, and that magazine had ads for hardware, for like a card that you could put into a computer. And I thought, wow, that's a great reason to have a computer. I could edit at home. And so I went off with my colleague Stefan Avalos, and we built our own computers, and we ended up making this movie, and we tried to make it for no money, because at the time I was trying to make a science fiction film on Super 16, and I failed. I raised about 30,000 of the 250,000 and returned the money to the people who I had been raising it from. And Stefan had been ripped off by a foreign sales agent. And so we were really interested in, could we take this new technology and break from permission-based culture and make a work, and could we make it for no money? Well, when we went forward and we ended up totaling up all the receipts, and thanks to the generosity of our friends and family, we ended up making this movie for $900. And I think you would have been hard-pressed the year that it came out in 1998 to find a line item for the Titanic, which was the largest film at that time, that would have been $900. And so The Last Broadcast is interesting because it took 86 days to render this movie. 86 days on those computers we built ourselves. It became the first all-digital release of a motion picture. It went on to gross over $5 million through self-distribution efforts. And we innovated the first all-digital release of a motion picture via satellite. So we actually have a little cinematic milestone as being the first all-digital release. And I think one of the reasons that I succeeded with this, or we succeeded with this, was because we were naive. I think if I would have known what it would have taken to make this, I probably wouldn't have made it. And so throughout my career, I've tried to embrace that sense of being naive, or being open and curious, and being willing to try to do different things. So I think my parents maybe kind of realized a little bit more what I was doing when this happened. This is when the movie was actually a question on Jeopardy. It was a double Jeopardy question that the contestant actually got right, which was an added bonus. But it was interesting because this little movie went on to radically innovate within the film industry and kind of took the studio system by surprise, totally by surprise. Because at the time we did this, we were living in the middle of nowhere on a farm in outside of Philadelphia. And so when I think about this, I think about this idea of how at the time I kind of felt confined by this idea of formats and running times and platforms, and that I had been defined as a filmmaker, but I wanted to change that. I wanted to find a way that I could make work that was more kind of seamless, that it was moving, spilling off screens and into the real world and back. And so I started to experiment more with my second film, which I released in 2006, where I did a theatrical release of it, DIY. I ended up selling it to Showtime. I released it on DVD, and I staged a number of cinematic events. And I want to share some of those with you today, because I think what I did with the first film, which was innovating the distribution, I started to weave gaming and mobile technology and interactive comics into this next work, and started to really lean into the transmedial nature, like kind of building a world around what I was doing. What you see in front of you here is an ecosystem of that experience. It consisted of a feature film, there was an interactive comic, there was a web series, there were places that players could remix things online and they would unlock special content. There was a mobile tie-in, and then there were live events. For this example, I want to demonstrate the feature film, interactive comic, mobile, and live events. So I want you to imagine that the year is 2006, 2007. There still are readily available payphones all over. And when people would be making their way to the venue, because I took this and reimagined it by dropping it into different types of venues to kind of create this immersive experience. You know, looking back on it now, it's like a precursor. It had certain immersive theater qualities to it. It had certain, social gaming aspects to it. And it obviously had traditional kind of storytelling at the center of it. So the feature film, you're going to see the feature film, you're walking to see it, and we've written software that rings all the payphones up and down the block. So if you stop and you pick up one of the payphones, you hear this weird subliminal kind of weird audio, sound score, and foreshadowing of a story, but you're not really sure what it is, and you kind of hang up the phone and you walk around the corner and you encounter a preacher preaching fire and brimstone. And that preacher is handing out these small, like little comics. And you might take a comic and you take it with you and you end up going into the theater. And when you walk into the theater, there's a sign like on the screen that says, you know, whatever you do, do not call this number. Danger, danger, right? And of course, like upwards of 90% of the audience did. And once they did, we captured their phone numbers and we had their phone numbers. And when the movie started playing, characters started to emerge from the audience. And all of a sudden, everybody's phones started ringing. And we started connecting people to each other's phones. And it was total amazing chaos, right? And people were like, what is going on? It was almost like a scene from like Lawnmower Man or something where all these phones are ringing. And then the movie would end and people would make their way home and they might look at that comic that they got from that street preacher and they flip it over and it says, do you want to play a game? At which point they would enter a URL and they would go to the interactive comic for the site. And they would start moving through the comic and then their phone would ring. And when their phone would ring, it would be the nemesis from the movie. And we built this so it was all built to scale and it was all automated. The nemesis from the movie would start asking them questions through their mobile phone, and whatever they said through their mobile phone would start to launch video and audio on their browser. And of course, that was like ultimately surprising to them. And at a certain point, the character said, tell me something about yourself that nobody knows, at which point the participant, audience member, would say something into their phone and it would start looping on their computer speakers and they'd be totally freaked out. And then they would go and they'd try to exit and they'd hit this exit box. The only thing was it was a fake exit box. And when they clicked on it, we knew they were clicking on it. And we dumped them into a conference call with everybody else that was experiencing the same thing at the same time. What I'm telling you about here is interesting because it starts as a kind of an isolated experience, moves into a communal experience, moves into an isolated experience, back to a communal experience again. And it also is an early representation of the way that a world can bridge not only virtually, but also into the real world and back. And so I think as I went forward, I started to really love this notion of what does it take to make something enchanted. I love this quote by Arthur C. Clarke. It's one of his 3 laws. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So I really kind of looked at that and I thought, how can I make work that's enchanted, that feels magical, where the technology is seamless to the experience? And here you see a diagram for a hero's journey. When we think about stories, you know, Joseph Campbell famously studied over 1,000 different tales and came to realize that they had these similar traits. And if you look at this mapping of a hero's journey, you could place any Pixar film over top of it. You could place Star Wars over top of it. And for the longest time, it's been this kind of beacon for the way that people approach stories, you know, this idea of moving from the known into the unknown. But we're in this amazing opportunity where that's radically shifting, and it's not just one narrative, it's shared narratives. And what does that look like? It's not just one journey, it's more of kind of a collective journey. So I love this diagram because it starts to make you think about the mapping of stories, makes you think about how characters move through stories. And you see a very complex story world like The Lord of the Rings, and you see all the different characters in the intersections as they make their way across that quest and that journey. You see Star Wars, and then I love it where Primer is down towards the bottom there, like kind of a little spoiler alert. It's a time travel film, and the protagonists keep encountering themselves throughout it, so that's why it's that squiggly kind of mess. And then a linear progression of a story like 12 Angry Men. And I think just thinking about the way in which we map stories, or the way that we visualize stories, or the way that we move through those stories is kind of fascinating. And in my practice, I've been trying more and more over the course of the last 20 years to think about ways in which it's not just a passive experience of moving through, but it's something where it also can be immersive and something where you're also encountering other individuals who are within those worlds. So if I think about that, I think about this notion of those formerly known as the audience. If we're in a moment that is one to many, the paradigm has been around forever, but now that moment is shifting to a many to many. That gave rise during, kind of the rise of Web 2.0, which we're at the kind of the tail end of, where algorithms became the dominant force and everything became about social, and it kind of opened up this possibility that, though everyone was a storyteller, you could push button publish for the world to see, good, bad, or indifferent. It was a reality, and the cat was out of the bag, or Pandora was out of the box, or any of the metaphors that you would like to use. But I think what's interesting about thinking about those formerly known as the audience really challenges this notion of auteur theory, challenges this notion of a hierarchy that has existed for so long within storytelling practice and within the entertainment industry in particular. And I was struck by, during the pandemic, my son, who's 13, invited me, I guess I could say it that way, to hang out with him in Fortnite when Travis Scott was doing a show. And that marked the first time that Fortnite was doing a performance, and Travis Scott dropped in, and over 28 million people participated in that first one, and they've subsequently gone on to do a number of other types of live events within Fortnite, which is kind of very much a world building type of a game set against a battle royale format, last man or last person standing, and also a creative mode where you can just kind of build and create. But the world allows you to lay your imagination over top of it. But I'm showing you this because Fortnite happened to be the place where everything congregated. The reason I wanted to bring it up is, at the same time my son and I were in Fortnite during the Travis Scott show, my son was making thumbnails for a friend of his who was a YouTube streamer who was streaming out a fashion show to over, a couple 100,000 people. And what I was struck by is kind of these creative ecosystems. Yes, there was an event that was happening in this world, and there were people off playing, and then the Travis Scott was performing, and then my son was doing this peripheral thing with some friends across another network, and that is rudimentary, like very fragmented, the idea of the metaverse, right? It's kind of flowing across these different platforms, but the thing that's connecting it is the social element of it and the collaborative element of it, and the potential storytelling, not just the storytelling that's happening then, but the benefit of the storytelling and the experiences and the way that you can reflect them afterwards. So if story is the same, it's really the telling that's changing. So how is that telling changing, and what can we learn from that? And so what I want to share here now as I go into this section of the talk is I want to kind of take you on this journey of some of the work that I've done both in my own practice and also that I've done through the Digital Storytelling Lab, where we explore new forms and functions of story. Forms being emergent technologies such as AI, the Internet of Things, virtual reality, augmented reality, decentralized technologies like the blockchain, as well as functions, storytelling for healing and for learning and for mobilization and policy change and entertainment. And so these works that I'm going to show are kind of these explorations. They're kind of experimenting with different ways to engage audiences, different ways to utilize technology, and they're rooted through this notion of kind of exploring aesthetics, meaning feelings, or an attempt to create emotional resonance during that storytelling. But they don't exist unless the audience, or those formerly known as the audience, are actively participants in what they are. So the first is this notion of Project Immerse. It's a collaborative, deep fake paranoid thriller that plays out across Zoom and Miro. And for a number of you, you'll actually get a chance to experience this. So I'm just going to tease this at a high level. The idea is that here it's making use of an infinite canvas. I was really struck and subverted kind of these productivity tools. Mainly this uses Miro and Zoom. subverting them and turning them into collaborative storytelling and sense-making tools. I think the pandemic has given rise to, or at least allowed people to recognize the value of web pervasive tools, some of which have existed for quite some time, but being able to revisit them in different ways that allow you to tell a story. So in this particular story, the narrative conceit is that somebody has dumped a bunch of data, and you're not sure why or who or what it's trying to say, and you work with a group of people to make sense of it. So you have editorial permission within the space. So what you're looking at here is a collage, and you can move through that collage and uncover a variety of different things. And as you do so, there's rich media in there. There's video assets, there's audio assets, there's text, images. A large percentage of this is crafted and utilizes artificial intelligence. The thing that's interesting about this piece is it delves into notions of apathenia and the idea of how patterns shape the world around us and how we use stories to help make sense of those patterns. So the project has a variety of different deep fakes, and we stylize them and do them in a variety of ways. This is an example of one of the deep fakes. And what's interesting about this piece is in saying that 90% of it is made with AI, that means like the video, the audio, the text, the voiceovers, the editing, the score is all constructed with a machine. These are examples of some of the deep fakes that sit within the actual project itself. And you know, what's striking about going through this, we spent a lot of time doing some studying around QAnon and kind of uncovering elements of how conspiracies are shaped and so forth and so on. And that was like an underpinning element of this project, which we had been working on for well over a year before the incident at the Capitol on January 6th, which then made the project even more prescient. But the story itself is kind of an AI that's trained on the following data sets: declassified redacted documents, data dumps from Blue Leaks, WikiLeaks, political speeches, court documents, fake news stories, 70s paranoid thrillers. So this piece is very much like almost like a William S. Burroughs cut up. It experiments with the technology. AI is a creative companion within this. And we're augmenting a creative process by using artificial intelligence. Moving forward, the things that I think will make the metaverse work are game engines and this idea of being able to have generative worlds. You know, we saw that in the early incarnations of things like No Man's Sky, where you could travel through space and ultimately it was constantly generating worlds. And ironically, there was a complaint initially when that game came out that people couldn't find other people. It was, you know, very much, I guess, akin to what actual space travel would be like. But then it's through subsequent releases, modified that a bit. But this idea that game engines could create, or that you could empower generative worlds, and this notion that AI could be part of creating, you know, virtual beings or avatars, or that could change and could be personalized in a variety of ways. And so that notion of thinking about storytelling in a way that, on one hand, game engines are rapidly accelerating, virtual production is becoming more of a reality, AI is becoming better at certain core elements, you know, all the way through the production chain, you know, not only in production the way I'm talking about it here, but also in the pre-visualization, the prep phases, and all the way through post and so forth and so on. And I think that what that points to is the last ingredient is really audience members and those formerly known as the audience. And because the metaverse is going to require an immense amount of story and an immense amount of content. And so, you know, with Project Immerse, we were just exploring this notion of what would it be like to craft a collaborative story that explores misinformation and deception, but is designed and made with, you know, artificial intelligence. So that's like one speculation that I wanted to show you, right? The next I want to show you is Frankenstein AI. And Frankenstein AI kind of takes this narrative conceit that Frankenstein's monster has been wandering the internet in search of what it means to be human. And it's become confused because what it's encountered is a lot of polarization and toxicity, extreme hate and extreme love. And it decides it's going to assemble people in the real world so it can ask questions of them in order to understand what it is to be human. And so we took this project to Sundance, where it was one of the first AI projects that was there. And when people would come into this experience, they would walk into a dark room and they would sit down with other people and they would start to share stories. One would share a story about isolation and the other would share a story about connection. And all of a sudden the table in front of them, which was a Microsoft Surface unit, would come to life. And they could start to interact with it and start to map the conversation that they were having with each other. So in mapping that conversation, data was being collected, right? And so the themes within Shelley's work are really perfect for this exploration. You know, the idea is that the AI becomes a metaphor for artificial intelligence. And one of the core themes within the book is really kind of this idea of something that we create getting out of our control, right? And also the book really examines the other and isolation and connection and so forth and so on. And so as they would sit there and have that conversation, they would use kind of this planchette, and that planchette that they had, they could put their fingers on, and as they moved it, it would spark, and they could manipulate the table. So this idea of like physical kind of artifacts mixed with human interaction, mixed with a surface kind of unit and then data collection helped what became the next phase of this in the second act. In the second act, people made their way into a room and there was a huge tank, probably almost 2.5 meters across, and it was projected through smoke, and it was using you know, it was visualizing things in real time. It was amorphous and then became human formed and moved back and forth. And the circular elements that you see there are actually drums. They were IoT enabled and they became the voice of the AI. And so what we did here that was interesting was we flipped the script on how you think about an AI. And we made it so most people rely on the only AI interaction they have is usually through a mobile device, at which point the AI is a personal assistant and they don't really think about it. They were always asking questions of it. We thought it would be really interesting to flip that and have the AI asking questions of us in terms of what it meant to be human. So a group of people are now in this room. The AI has greeted them by name, and the AI starts to ask them questions. We created a chatbot, which we affectionately called Fakenstein, and Fakenstein was trained to talk in Shelley prose. We used that to build the corpus, and then we collected a large variety of data sets from the internet, and that was used to build a question corpus. So the AI would ask questions. One of the first questions that the AI asked was, why do we like having sex even though we can see in color? And then the next question it asked was, what is it like to wear human? So now the group hears this question, for instance, what is it like to wear human? And they wonder, are there times when we're not human? When are we not human? And they would have a philosophical kind of conversation, and then they would commit something to the AI. They would basically help the AI to learn. The data that was collected in this particular instance was then used for a dance piece where a dancer was controlled by an AI through an earpiece, through kind of machine learning choreography. And so you had this really interesting element where folks could see traces of things that they had done through other parts of the experience in this final dance piece. And this was performed in front of a live audience at Sundance and culminated that 3-act structure that I just described. So we then experimented with this project, and we thought we were commissioned by the National Theatre in London and by ITFA Doc Lab to explore this notion of a dinner party. What would it be like to have a dinner party with an AI? And so we created this dinner party where what effectively happened was a group of people would sit down around a table and we'd have large groups in a room, you know, a classic kind of dinner setup. And there would be earpieces that they could put in while they were at the table. And the AI would talk to them while they were at the table, and it might say, I'm only speaking to you, rephrase this question or this statement in your own words, or it might say, lean over to the person next to you and whisper this in their ear, or it might ask something of the whole table at the same time. And so the AI was this really interesting host that was constantly kind of in their ears and present. And it became a really interesting way to communicate and talk about the potential of AI, the dangers of AI, the challenges of AI. Because a lot of the work that we do, these last two projects are parts of the lab, is really what's known as discursive design. It's this idea that you create these artifacts that allow people to gather and have a conversation together around potentially polarizing issues. The next piece that I want to share is a piece that kind of really starts to think about this idea of moving from physical into the virtual. You've seen that in different ways with the other pieces that I've just mentioned, but this piece does it in and around an immersive documentary, because I wanted to give show how on one hand we're doing something that's genre related, a conspiratorial thriller, or is related to Frankenstein, which is kind of sci-fi horror. This piece is related to an immersive documentary, and it represents one of the most personal pieces I've ever attempted to make, and it's called Where There's Smoke. And it started as a physical installation for 4 people that was set within a storefront, a 1,400 square foot storefront in New York. It was part of the Tribeca Film Festival, and in 2019 it premiered, and it was slated to travel and go to a number of other places, but COVID kind of changed those plans. But at its core, it's an immersive storytelling experience about life, loss, and memory. And it tells the story about my father when, us finding out when he was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And at that moment, there was a total lack of empathy within care. And so the piece, is inciting incident, and I guess you could say, is really this desire to say, is there a way that stories can help to heal? Is there a way that they could be harnessed to help people deal with end of life or process grief? But at the same time, this story is centered around, I grew up in a firefighting household. My dad was a volunteer firefighter and also an amateur fire scene photographer, and for over 20 years. And in my youth, we had these 2 devastating fires where our van erupted in flames on a vacation and our house burnt to the ground. And I always wondered if my dad had actually set them. So this piece really kind of explores how memory is malleable. And the theme for this piece is really about being clouded by grief. What you're seeing here is this piece is kind of almost like immersive theater, but without actors, an escape room with no escape, and kind of a documentary that's not linear, it's actually generative. So it's different every time people go through it. People would find their way into the space using just flashlights. And within the space, there were a number of enchanted objects. You can see them. There was a 35 millimeter projector on the table. Just imagine this is all dark. You're moving with flashlights. You smell smoke. And as you enter the room, if you pick up one of the objects that you have that's represented on a map that you're carrying, the room comes to life. Audio starts playing. The table lights up. There's squares in the center of the table that are light panels, and they come to life. And the different elements that you interact with, the objects that you interact with, when you put them in certain orders, which you see here, where you see the telephone, the camera, the cassette tape, and the walkie-talkie, when you put them in different orders, what they do is they unlock narrative, they unlock stories, they unlock experiences. But as you do it, every time you make a choice is taken away from you, and you see the decline of my father. So you see it through an aesthetic of a mechanic, of a matching mechanic, but then you're making decisions with the group that you're with, and every time you unlock something, it unlocks a narrative story, a little framework, like a little narrative piece where I'm interviewing my father and there's slides. Now, that was the experience, 4 people at a time, going through an immersive experience that's powered by the Internet of Things, that then translated into this notion of using, once again, I used Miro and Zoom, and I ended up creating this experience that was online, that had you moving through these fragmented collages with 100 other people at the same time. And they were often breakout rooms with you as you were maneuvering and uncovering journal entries and videos and interviews and documentation and so forth and so on, that, you were kind of moving concurrently through this infinite canvas where you could get lost, kind of like if you were at a music festival. If you get lost in a music festival, you're texting your friend and you're trying to find each other. This Miro, at least in the way that we were using it in these experiences, is like an infinite canvas. You can get lost in it. And that's very exciting because most of the web, you currently always know where you are, right? Or you know how to navigate. The last example that I have is very related to the blockchain, and it's basically a project that explores new myth making, and it leverages this idea of 7 generations of a story over time, and this notion of using the blockchain as a way to kind of create these story blocks, and to create, in the case of fairy tales, enchanted objects. And the more objects that there are, you can draw from, and you can use them to tell stories that you pass from one generation to the next, because in this, the 7th generation, which is in the future, has reached back to everyone and is saying, we need your help. And so generation, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in this experience start to create these fairy tales that are used to transfer information and ultimately knowledge to the next generation. So it kind of has elements of an RPG, like a role-playing game, mixed with a bit of immersive theater, mixed with a bit of an escape room. And it's cinematic because it also connects to a tool that we're releasing at the lab this month as open source, which allows you to remix the web. You can remix any domain that you want. You could do it over a spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet, or a Google Doc. You can do it across Miro. You can do it any way you want. It's almost like a Photoshop for the web. It allows you to add animated GIFs and video and audio, and you can start to create an experience. This is an example from recently we ran something at CGIS, and all the layering that you're seeing here. And let me see if I can actually play this. All the layering that you're seeing here. Actually, it's not going to let me. The layering that you're seeing here is all done by a group of people collaboratively, because the tool allows a group of people to remix the web at the same time. So it's kind of almost like a stage management tool, and it allows, like, each of these images that you see are layers of animated GIFs or video or audio, and then the background in this case is the background plane is Miro itself. So leveraging attention management feature within that, we can move the board around and we can start to create this depth that's really interesting. But in this case at CGIS, which is an international film festival in Spain, which is a prestigious festival for sci-fi and for fantasy, we did it there where an audience came into the room and they crafted the story that played out on screen. So the film didn't exist until they made it together during a 2-hour session. And it was really very exciting and electric. And this project is exploring decentralized storytelling and new myth making. So I want to share now in the final time that we have these things that altered my creative practice. I showed you these crazy kind of speculations that are pushing at the edges of the way that stories being told and audiences are being interacted with. What I started to realize was in my practice that there's a disconnect between when I write something versus when I'm coding something. And the development time for those things are very different. And so these things altered my practice in the sense that they helped me start to think more both about human-centric design, rapid iteration, imbuing game mechanics and methods used within game design, as well as experience design. So design thinking is probably common to a number of people. It's a practice that allows you to move through an iterative process. Starts with kind of a shared ethnography through an empathy phase. You surface questions, you surface insights, then you frame a question, which becomes your design question. How might we? That question then leads to a variety of ideation. You start to try to answer that question with ideas. Then once you have final, you start to get some ideas, then it's time to test those ideas as prototypes and make them tangible in some way. And then as you test them, you gain feedback and you repeat the cycle. And so that's an interesting way to kind of bridge or start to think about some of the technology you choose to use. And this is often used as ways to design. It's used in Fortune 500 companies. It's used in NGOs. It's used all over the place. It's very pervasive these days. Design practice is something that we're fascinated by because it scales. This is a diagram by Elliot P. Montgomery, who is a futurist, and it demonstrates how design moves from a constrained to an unconstrained, it moves along this plane. And a lot of the design that we do kind of goes across and sits kind of in the center, or the design that I do, right? It borrows and it considers strategy. At the same time, it builds out these speculative worlds. At the same time, it infuses art making. And it's really intended to allow for collective sense making in a way that folks can kind of embrace ambiguities. And so I think it's interesting to think about the ways that different design practice can make its way into the work. This is an experiential futures ladder. It's a framework by Dr. Stuart Candy, who is another futurist who's at Carnegie Mellon. And once again, you see that views of the future tend to be very abstracted. So this notion of how do you go from an abstracted view of the future to something that becomes more concrete and specific. And for those who write, you'll probably recognize the words settings, scenarios, and situations, but stuff are artifacts. So you kind of use the setting, the scenario, and the situation to bring you to a place where you're creating a tangible artifact from the future. And you're using that as a way to have conversation and as a way to examine and embrace this notion of yes and thinking as you project or imagine what futures could be. MDA is another thing that that we use in our practice. It's a formal approach to game design and game research. It says that a player consumes a game one particular way and the designer creates it from the other side. M stands for mechanics, D stands for dynamics, which is behavior, and A stands for aesthetics. When a player plays a game, they feel something, then they learn the behavior that results in that feeling, and they ultimately learn the mechanic. The designer starts with the mechanic and thinks about the behavior that they want the mechanic to produce, and then hopefully how that leads to some sort of a feeling in the player, thus the aesthetic. We often take the aesthetic and think about, mapping that against what is somebody thinking, feeling, and doing as they're moving through a story or through a story world, and also how are they coming into it, how are we onboarding them, and how are they leaving it, and how are we catching them on the other side. There's a white paper around this, which is called A Formal Approach to Game Design and Research. If you're interested, I recommend giving it a read. The final is this notion of experience design, which in my sense, experience design is this opportunity to really kind of explore the way in which people move through spaces. I believe experienced designers are the future of what has fundamentally been directors, but they challenges you to really kind of think about spatially and to think about worlds and not necessarily a singular format or running time or a platform. And so the experience design, I think, is really kind of the connective tissue. And when I say experience design, I'm not talking about UX. I'm talking about these experiences within these storytelling worlds. So I want to leave you with these. These are 4 kind of guiding principles that I use constantly in the work that I do. The first is the thematic frame. The second is the idea of a trace. The third is granting agency. And the fourth is this notion of serendipity management. So the thematic frame is this idea that participants can contribute to the experience because they have pre-existing understanding of its foundation. Frankenstein allows for people to kind of step into that world, and they have shared language that they can use around the notion of being isolated or connected, right? Or this notion of something not being human and trying to understand what it means to be human. There's a frame for that. In a piece like Where There's Smoke, the thematic frame is this idea of being clouded by grief. In a piece like Blockchain Fairy Tale, it's this idea of how fairy tales are enchanted and what can they tell us, not just around morality, but also how they can be used to help us understand and process the world. And in something like Project Immerse, the thematic frame is this notion of a deep fake conspiracy thriller and how our theories shaped. The second is this notion of the trace. The participant can see their contributions within the story. This is incredibly important, and we've learned this from running experiences all over the world, the more that somebody can see some little piece of themselves in something, the higher the engagement is, the better the learning retention is, and so forth and so on. The third is this idea of granting agency. The participant is granted agency to make decisions as a team and individually, and they can identify how their actions impacted the experience. We've found that teams work really well when there are 4 to 6 people. If they're too small, dominant personalities take over, and if they're too large, it becomes a consensus vortex and nobody can ever make a decision. And so we try to do things where somebody might be an individual in a moment in an experience, they might be paired, they might be in a team, and this tension between agency for one versus many becomes even more critical within something like the metaverse. And the last is this idea of serendipity management. I want to leave you with this because I think, how can we design experiences that leave room for people to foster collaboration, right? In the sense that I would argue that a lot of digital worlds or digital experiences are over-designed. They're so concerned that somebody is going to break them that they don't leave blank space for serendipity to happen. So how can we create worlds, especially at a time where things are so chaotic and so unknown, and as the start of this announced what Facebook had mentioned last week with a name change, decentralized technologies and this ability to kind of imagine possibilities and to leave room for them through something like serendipity management, I think becomes critical, because we're at a juncture where there's going to be a large group of people who are going to try to make the metaverse centralized, a walled garden. We're also at a moment where decentralized technology has rapidly accelerated, which means that we could actually have decentralized worlds, which means we could have decentralized stories, which means we could have a totally new way to fund and produce and distribute and sustain from those stories. So to me, when I think about the metaverse, I'm not caught up in the technology. I'm more philosophically looking at it and looking at it from the opportunity space of how to design for human interactions within it, and not getting caught up in all the bells and whistles of the potential of the tech and what it might do and what it could do and who the players are. The person or the people who are going to thrive, in my opinion, in the metaverse are those who take the time to understand human experience and take the time to think about the way that people can basically have experiences that relate to their own identities, their own memories, their own stories. So in a way, as I mentioned before, story is the same. It's the telling that's changing. So I want to thank you very much for letting me talk today. Oh, I should say, if you're interested in getting in touch, here's some additional details here. On Twitter, you can find me at Lance Weiler, lance.weiler@columbia.edu, and digitalstorytellinglab.com. We're always looking for folks to collaborate with. I think maybe there's room for questions at this point.
Exactly. So all you guys who are listening to this keynote right now, you have the chance to ask your questions right now in the chat. I think we might have the first questions there already. The other option would be that you raise your hand and we can even see you on the screen here, and you can talk in person and ask your question personally to Lance. One question I had, Lance, and you just said it when you just mentioned that you collaborate with different people, was how your team looks like. Do you always work with the same guys, or for every project, like a film producer, you look for certain people specifically for one project? How do you work? What is your working mode there?
Sure. Thank you for that question. A lot of the work that I do is really kind of predicated on groups of people. So they're very transdisciplinary, right? Like, so my teams consist of, there will be writers, and there will be creative technologists and folks who are researchers. But then I'll also have people who are working in terms of strategy, people who are maybe work within dramaturgy, you know, who are kind of very traditional in the way they think about the construction of worlds, mashed up with somebody who's thinking about strategy and objectives, combined with maybe somebody who thinks about engagement, you know, and sometimes other types of design practice. But every time it's different, right? Like every method is kind of different. The core elements really kind of relate to those principles I mentioned and are kind of project specific, but we try as much as possible to have as many diverse perspectives as we can when we're actually working on something. And we try to make it that we're very fluid. Like one of the biggest things that we try to do is leave space. Like we try to hold space for ambiguity as much as we can in the beginning of a process. And try to be as open as we can be to the possibilities and to try to transcend assumptions. So that's often done with as many different, you know, that's accelerated, and the development is often accelerated due to folks from different disciplines.
Story that, for example, Frankenstein AI, was it first your idea to do something about the Frankenstein story world, or your first idea was to do something about artificial intelligence?
It was kind of a combination, right? It was this idea that we thought it would be really interesting to explore this notion of some of the core themes of the work. And we thought that Frankenstein was an amazing metaphor for artificial intelligence. So it kind of started, because when we did it, it was around the 200th anniversary of the book. So it definitely started on the foundational story side, but then we started to see ways that we could explore artificial intelligence, because often at the lab we'll do design research projects, and it felt like a really, you know, very vivid world to live in, and an interesting way to do an adaptation of Frankenstein that maybe wasn't traditional in the way that it was operating. You know, what would it be like to unleash a monster, and what would that monster, if it had been unleashed, you know, what if it was trying to become human, which is something that, you know, in the story itself, you know, Frankenstein's monster is craving human interaction and connection. So we just thought it was an interesting kind of metaphor for where artificial intelligence was. But it kind of started with Frankenstein and AI kind of all at the same time in that particular project.
Okay, then thanks a lot, Lance. Very interesting insights that you gave us. We also have a lot of positive feedback on the chat. Everyone was quite inspired by your keynote. I will switch back to German now to make a short introduction to our next program point. But thanks a lot. Thanks for being here live from New York. Lance Weiler. Wenn ihr als Teilnehmer der Immersive X noch mehr von Lance Weiler und seinem Team sehen wollt, dann könnt ihr das Projekt, was er vorhin beschrieben hat, das Project Immerse, auch erleben um 22 Uhr. Heute Abend. Dafür müsst ihr euch auf der Webseite anmelden. Da gibt es einen Button, da könnt ihr draufklicken und dann seid ihr nachher dabei und könnt diese Deepfake Paranoid Thriller Experience erleben, was ja sehr spannend klingt, auch nach allem, was Lance uns darüber erzählt hat. Unser nächster Programmpunkt, jetzt um 21 Uhr, wird wieder in der Area X, also in der virtuellen Welt sein. Dort gibt es seit einiger Zeit, nämlich ziemlich genau seit der letzten Immersive X, einen Donnerstag pro Monat immer die sogenannte X-Night, wo Experten aus dem Bereich Storytelling der Zukunft, Technologien, Zukunft der Medien, die Community teilhaben lassen an ihren Gedanken. Und dort haben wir heute unseren Gast, nämlich Wladimir Alexejew, mit der spannenden Frage, ob künstliche Intelligenz kreativ sein kann. Das werden wir dort hoffentlich gleich lernen, 21 Uhr in der Area X. Also gerne dran denken, nochmal checken, ob ihr auch, ob die Headsets aufgeladen sind, ob ihr ready seid für eine weitere VR-Experience. Ein weiterer Hinweis dafür, das Event ist öffentlich. Das ist einfach die letzten Monate immer schon so gewesen in der Allspace-Welt. Also wir haben dort ein internationales Publikum. Dementsprechend wird auch der nächste Programmpunkt dann auf Englisch sein. Wir freuen uns um 21 Uhr, also in wenigen Minuten, euch wiederzusehen in der virtuellen Welt. Bis dahin, tschüss aus dem Studio hier in Berlin.